Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going deep on some stuff happening in New Jersey right now. And it's kind of a mixed bag, really, like the good, the bad, and the ugly when you look at the state of the infrastructure and the finances.
Yeah, you flag some pretty eye-opening information about what's going on.
Yeah, like, on the one hand, you got crumbling roads, on the other hand, a massive state budget. And then, you see some surprisingly outdated tech in, like, basic public services.
Right, it's a real head-scratcher.
Yeah. So our goal today is to really peel back the layers here, go beyond just the headlines and try to figure out what are the core issues at play here. And then what do they actually mean for people who live here, work here? Even if you're just someone who's interested in why a state with a strong economy is still struggling with these types of problems.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure. And we're basing all this on a recent podcast that really caught our attention. It's called Potholes, Sinkholes, and Gold Bars. Where's New Jersey's money going?
Catchy title, right?
Yeah, it is. And it kind of lays out a pretty stark picture. So what we want to do is, connect the dots. Like, why are we seeing these issues keep popping up, even though there's a big budget and a lot of economic activity?
Right, it doesn't seem to add up at first glance.
Yeah. So let's start with what the podcast calls, rather dramatically, New Jersey's asphalt apocalypse. And they're talking about the situation on Route 80 East, which seems like it's a lot more than just a few potholes.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a lot more serious than that. The podcast really highlights a critical problem on, one of the major transportation routes in the state. And you were mentioning this recurring sinkhole near Wharton.
Right, yeah. This thing, it first appeared in December and you patched it up.
Yeah, but then it just gave way again in February.
I mean, that's just a few months later.
Exactly. And they're saying repairs will probably take at least another 2 months.
Wow.
So that kind of disruption, think about the impact it has on people's lives. Businesses trying to get goods where they need to go, it ripples out.
Yeah, a 2-month closure on a major highway like that is going to cause a lot of headaches.
For sure.
But what really got me is it's not just this one spot, right? They're saying the DOT has identified 90 potential voids under Route 80.
90.
Yeah, 90. I mean, is the whole road just going to collapse?
Well, it does raise some serious questions about the, structural integrity of the whole highway, and the podcast kind of speculates about it. Maybe there's old mines underneath that are contributing to the problem.
Right.
But, it also makes you think, how is this thing built in the first place?
Right.
And what kind of maintenance and inspections have been done over the years? These voids, they could be caused by things like soil erosion that's been happening gradually, and then you get the heavy traffic, the weather, maybe even problems with the roadbed itself.
Yeah, and I was reading that to detect these things, they use ground-penetrating radar.
Right.
Like something you'd use to find buried treasure.
Yeah, exactly, like an archaeological dig. But no, it's for finding problems under the asphalt.
Wild. So all this gets so bad that Governor Murphy declares a state of emergency on March 8th.
Right.
And he goes to the federal government for funding.
Right.
But here's where the numbers don't make sense to me. We're talking about a state with a $59 billion budget projected for 2025.
Right.
I mean, how does a state with that kind of money need to go begging to the feds for something as basic as fixing a highway?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to how state budgets work. Even though $59 billion is a huge amount of money, that money is already divided up into categories. So you've got education, healthcare, pensions, all these different things. So it's not like they have this big pile of cash they can just throw at any problem that comes up.
Right.
There might be rules about how much they can move around from the general fund, to cover something like this.
Okay.
It's also possible that, going to the feds is part of a strategy.
Oh, okay.
Because the federal government often has money specifically set aside for infrastructure projects. So maybe that frees up some state money to spend on other things.
Right.
It's kind of like a shell game, but with billions of dollars.
Makes sense, I guess. But it still begs the question about the state's priorities.
Yeah.
Right? Because the podcast really digs into this whole issue of the budget just growing and growing.
Right.
It went up $5 billion from 2024 to 2025. I mean, that's a big jump year over year.
It is. And while, budget increases can happen for a lot of reasons, inflation, maybe more people are moving to the state, new programs, all these things.
Right.
The podcast really nails it when they ask, are people actually seeing the benefits of this bigger budget?
Right. Like, where's all this money going?
Exactly. They're pointing out this disconnect between the money and what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. And it's not just Route 80. They also talk about the technology in schools, which is apparently pretty bad outdated computers, unreliable internet access, and then there's the DMV, the never-ending saga of the DMV.
I mean, you'd think with a budget this size, they could fix some of these basic services. Yeah, you'd think so. And the podcast does give some specific numbers. They say about 20 billion is going to education and 10 billion to healthcare in the 2025 budget.
Okay.
But then they immediately turn around and talk about how schools are still struggling with their tech, and there's reports of problems with the drinking water in some places like Rockaway Township.
Right.
So it really makes you wonder, is the money actually being used effectively? Is it getting to the places where it's needed most?
It's a good question. And then there's the big one for New Jersey residents, property taxes.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast mentions that the average is about $9,000 a year, which is one of the highest in the country.
Yeah.
So, you'd expect that when you're paying that much in property taxes, you're going to get decent roads, good schools, efficient services.
Definitely. There's a sense of accountability that comes with those high property taxes. People feel like they're contributing a lot, and they expect the state to use that money wisely and provide the services they need.
Yeah.
So when you see Route 80 falling apart, or you're stuck in line at the DMV because their systems are ancient, it's understandable that people start to question where their money is going.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to another area that the podcast focuses on. They call it the tech time warp. And this is basically about all the old technology being used by the state government. It's pretty shocking.
Yeah. They don't sugarcoat it. They talk about how Trenton is still running on outdated software systems, which can make things really inefficient and even raise concerns about cybersecurity.
Right.
And then you've got the schools with their old computers and spotty internet. I mean, in this day and age, technology is so important for education, and they're falling behind.
It's crazy to think that in 2025, there are schools in a state like New Jersey that are struggling with basic internet access.
You would think that investing in education technology would be a top priority.
Absolutely.
And then there's the DMV, which everybody loves.
Oh, yeah, the DMV, everyone's favorite place.
The podcast talks about the long wait times, the outdated processes, and they point out that there's all this modern technology available, like biometrics facial recognition, that could really speed things up and make the whole experience less painful.
Yeah, anyone who's ever spent hours at the DMV can relate to that. Feels like you're stepping back in time.
Totally. And the thing is, this outdated technology doesn't just affect people on a personal level, it also has an impact on businesses.
Right, because we have a lot of businesses in New Jersey.
Over 1.8 million, actually. So when they have to deal with state services like getting permits or applying for grants and all that's running on old tech, it creates these bottlenecks and slowdowns.
Right.
Things that could be done quickly and easily online become these long, drawn-out processes, which can really hurt economic growth.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have all these big companies in New Jersey, in pharmaceuticals and other high-tech industries.
Yes.
Johnson & Johnson.
Right.
Merck, Pfizer, Novartis, Bristol-Myers Squibb.
Yeah.
These are global leaders in innovation. But then the state itself is stuck in the technological dark ages. It seems kind of weird.
Yeah, it is a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
These companies contribute a lot to the state's economy through taxes and jobs.
Right.
But that success doesn't always translate directly into modernizing public services.
Right.
It raises the question of how do we make sure that the prosperity generated by these big companies actually benefits everyone in the state?
It's a good point. And the podcast also gets into some of the political stuff surrounding these issues. They talk about Governor Murphy's response to the Route 80 mess and the budget debates.
Yeah, they mention his declaration of the state of emergency for Route 80 and how his administration went to the feds for money.
Right.
Asking for federal help can be necessary when you're dealing with a big infrastructure problem like that. But the podcast frames it in the context of the state's massive budget.
Right.
It makes you wonder, are they really doing everything they can with the money they already have?
Right. Are they setting the right priorities?
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing with Senator Bob Menendez and the allegations about gold bars. It's kind of a strange thing to bring up, but the podcast uses it to make a point.
Yeah, it's definitely a jarring juxtaposition. They're putting this image of potential corruption and wealth hoarding next to the very real problem of crumbling infrastructure that affects everyday people.
Right. It's like a symbol of the disconnect between the haves and the have-nots.
Exactly. And the image of gold bars really drives that point home. It's a stark contrast between the extravagance of some and the struggles of others.
Yeah, and I think it reflects the frustration that the podcast is trying to express, this idea that some people are doing really well while the basic needs of the state are being neglected.
Right.
But it's important to remember, as the podcast itself emphasizes, they're not coming at this from a particular political angle.
Yeah, they make it clear that they're focused on the well-being of New Jersey residents and businesses, and they're trying to look beyond partisan politics.
Right. The overall feeling is one of concern and disappointment that a state with as much money as New Jersey is still struggling with these basic problems.
Definitely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the podcast, a few key takeaways really stand out.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that disconnect we keep talking about. New Jersey has a lot of money, both in its state budget and its overall economy.
Right.
But the actual condition of its infrastructure and public services doesn't seem to reflect that.
Right. Route 80 is like a perfect example of that.
Yeah. And then you've got the outdated technology in all the state institutions. It points to a bigger problem with how the state is setting priorities and investing in things that matter to people.
Yeah, and the podcast really makes you think about how the state budget is being used. Are they holding people accountable, or are they making sure that taxpayer money is actually being spent on things that improve people's lives?
Right. And for you, the listener who wants to understand what's happening in your community, this deep dive should give you some insights into where your tax dollars are going and maybe where they're not going.
Yeah, and it highlights the importance of staying informed about these issues. Maybe even getting involved in the conversation about how resources are allocated and what the government should be focusing on.
And if you're a business owner in New Jersey, this whole thing about outdated technology is a big deal. It can really affect your ability to operate and grow.
So to finish things off, let's leave you with this thought. New Jersey has all this wealth and economic activity, but it's still dealing with these infrastructure and technology problems.
Right.
So the question is, why is that? What are the underlying systemic factors that are causing this? Is it just about the budget, or are there deeper issues with how the state is governed, how it plans for the future, how it manages projects?
It's a big question.
Yeah, it is, and it's one that's worth thinking about as you live and work in New Jersey.
Absolutely, because these problems aren't going away on their own. It's going to take some serious effort to fix them.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the state of New Jersey. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking, and we'll be back soon with another episode.
See you next time.
Bye.